Right. So now that we've given everyone a little bit of time, I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar, Navigating Supply Chain Uncertainties, Safeguarding Your Business Through Effective Risk Management and Productive Measures. We are very happy that you decided to join us today and spend some of your time with us. Now, before we start, a few organizational details. I would kindly ask you to please post all of your questions in the Q&A tool that you see at the bottom of your screen. Please use that. Everything that's posted in the chat might not be answered, so please use the Q&A tool. And then the recording and the slides of this webinar will be shared afterwards with all of you, hopefully by tomorrow. And after all these details, I would like to, first of all, give a warm welcome also to our speakers for today, Lorenz Berzau, a senior advisor from Vectra, and Jeswin Ernakeril from our lead account executive from Prewave. And because you all didn't come here to hear me talk, I'm now gonna hand over to Lorenz. Lorenz, stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Nina, and a very warm welcome to everybody from my side. So let me briefly start with who we actually are from the side of Vectra International. So you see it here on the slide. Basically, in this one sentence, we are global responsible business management consultants. So basically, we are a network of experts in more than 20 countries across the globe. We have about more than 70 experts on board. We're headquartered in Brussels, and basically we help organizations in basically being more successful in what they do, and particularly be more responsible in what they do. So basically what counts for us particularly is that with our help, organizations have a positive and particularly a sustainable business impact. And that could happen at any stage of global supply chain. So you can derive from that so that global supply chains make up a big part of where we are working on. We are helping companies a lot in this area. And so that also means that we help all kind of different companies of different sizes and industry sectors in different parts of the world. And naturally, risk management is one of these topics which is big on our agenda with our clients. So that is also one of the reasons why we are conducting this webinar together with Prewave. Now, talking about risk management, probably you have read and you have heard that all over the place, risk management here, risk management there. And the reason for this simply is that every organization is, since a number of years, going through quite challenging times. So these challenging times, which have been rather an exception in former days, have become the new normal, basically. I mean, we all, of course, remember vividly the experience of a pandemic as COVID-19 hit this planet, but we've also seen a lot of problems and challenges for many companies and organizations stemming from raw material shortages, from supply chain disruptions, political unrest. I mean, the war which is going on in Europe is just another example of that. And this all, of course, leads very often to disrupted supply chains. And this is just some examples of the challenges companies are facing. And of course, the aftermath of many of these things and tragedies partially happening is that it's very difficult for companies to maneuver and navigate through these waters, basically. So the main essence of what companies and organizations need to do basically is to become more resilient, right? And that's also a topic which is pretty much all over the place. Every organization needs to become more resilient, needs to be more strong, needs to safeguard itself more against all these risks and challenges and problems and disasters coming from all different sides. We have to be always prepared for something to come up. And that is basically the new normal. Every organization has to realize that it will probably never go back to these days where you can actually predict over a longer period of time how things are running and that everything is going smooth. The challenges around us will increase. And I think another example for that simply is also the climate change and everything which is connected to it. So being prepared, know what might go wrong in the future in the company, but also in our business partner network, in our supply chain, is something companies need to deal with. So, and that is why it's important to really understand where these risks might come from in the future, which violations actually exist. And I think another aspect is simply also that when it comes to specific types of risks, many companies are now also facing and are challenged also by the fact that there is more legislation in this regard, right? If we look at different countries in Europe and also in the Americas, for instance, there's legislation which basically obliges legally companies to conduct risk management, right? And throughout all the journey from identifying risks to addressing these. And so that's become also kind of a license to operate for companies, big and small. The legislative criteria are basically handed down also along supply chains and value chains. So basically every company needs to deal with the topic of risk management. So the first step in this process, of course, to identify risks. Where might they be? Where do they come from? Where do I need to pay more attention to? And so this is kind of setting the scene for this webinar, and I'm happy to hand over to Jeswin, who will talk more about this. So we just stop my screen share to enable Jeswin to take over.
Thank you, Lawrence. And I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. You should be able to see the slides. Yeah, we'll start with a brief introduction from our side as well. So Prewave, we're an Austrian company based here in Vienna, where everything started as well from a university project from one of our co-founders who was doing research back in 2012, so over 10 years ago already, on the topics of data science and machine learning algorithms. And she had a clear focus on ESG risks and labor strikes and poor working conditions. And the question for her PhD was, what type of risks and data can you find when you start analyzing publicly available data? That's where the idea came, and the spin-off of the university, Technical University of Vienna, started the journey of Prewave, where we then had piloting projects with like big companies in Germany, especially in the automotive industry. But since then, we've grown massively. So right now we have more than 100 employees, also more than 100 global clients. And very importantly here, every single one of our clients is coming from a different industry, and a lot of the clients have different use cases as well. So it's not a one-fit solution. And as Lawrence said, this whole topic of supply chain risk management is coming from various different departments focusing on different topics. Yeah, it could be, for example, in procurement from an operational perspective. As for example, The Economist found out that 6 to 10% of the annual revenue is spent on just managing supply chain disruptions, basically just firefighting, yeah, finding out about an issue and then spending that money to basically fix the supply chain again. But at the same time, for example, sustainability, ESG experts are fighting topics like toxications, pollutions, because companies might lose their license in certain countries if they pollute the environment, for example. Yeah. And as Lawrence also mentioned, the whole topics of legislations and regulations, yeah, is pushing this even further. Yeah, it's a very new topic, but it's a global topic. Yeah, you have, for example, the UFLPA in the US focusing on the human rights violations in China, and of course in Europe you have the German Lieferkettengesetz, or Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, focusing on the tier 1 suppliers. But at the same time, you have the European Union working on the CSDDD as well, which is going far more deeply into the supply chain than just looking at the tier 1 suppliers. What we have also seen so far and like heard from the conversation is that 90% of the companies that we talk to, or overall globally, is using static risk management, basically only accessing historic data. That could be, for example, sending out code of conducts to the suppliers, sending out questionnaires or assessments to the suppliers, or doing on-site audits at some of the critical suppliers. Yeah. And very important here is that Excel-based risk management is also static risk management. A lot of the companies also, when we talk to them, they think they are the only company using Excel as risk management, but I can tell you, you are not alone. Yeah, a lot of the companies are using static risk management. And what we do in the very first step is that we bring the companies, the clients that we work with in the very first step to tier 1 supplier monitoring. And with tier 1 supplier monitoring, you're usually already in the top 10% when it comes to risk management. Tier 1 supplier monitoring means that you get notifications instantly if something happens at your tier 1 supplier, and you can then take actions based on the criticality of the incident. From tier 1 level, you can also go deeper down into your supply chain. You could, for example, look at a whole supply chain of a certain commodity, which could be critical for your production. So it could be conflict minerals from an ESG perspective, but it also could be steel or aluminum or copper, yeah, raw materials which have production capacity issues. Yeah, and the top level of visibility would be not just focusing and monitoring your tier 1 suppliers, but identifying the relevant and critical tier 2, tier 3, tier N suppliers, and also monitoring them. Meaning that if something happens on a tier 2 or tier 3 level, you would then get a notification connected to the tier 1 supplier that could be affected, which means that you can then be proactive in approaching your tier 1 supplier and take the right remedial or preventive measures, depending on how critical the risk is in your supply chain. And when it comes to the wide variety of risk categories that we cover, it's also very important that there are over 140 different risk events, meaning the solution can be then customized to the end user or the department that is using Prewave. It could be a commodity buyer, for example, or a procurement buyer expert focusing on just the operational type of risks, so natural disasters, cyber risks, or operational stress, for example. And at the same time, it could be the compliance experts using Prewave to comply with the German Lieferkettengesetz or Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. Yeah. It also could be that certain supplier quality or performance experts focus monitor the suppliers for financial and legal stress. So monitoring, for example, if there are any mass layoffs happening at the suppliers to predict insolvencies, or are there any legal type of issues? Yeah, lawsuits, for example, in certain countries or certain locations where your supplier is based. And what's very interesting to see here is that the shift in the interest when it comes to risk management. Yeah, so I remember, for example, 2 or 3 years ago when COVID started, yeah, most of the conversations evolved around the operational type of stress, yeah, or if you think about the container ship blocking the Suez Canal, yeah. But if you look at the conversations that we're having now, most of the conversations, they usually start with, we need something for the regulations that are coming. We need something to comply with X amount of regulations in X amount of countries. Yeah? And what most companies do realize, and this is a very important topic, is that the compliance and regulation topic fits very well when it comes to end-to-end supply chain risk management, meaning that it's one of the categories when it comes to supply chain risk management, and the cycle or the pattern is very similar when it comes to the different regulations. It means that most regulations, they say that you need to identify and evaluate the risk in your supply chain. So you have to do an initial risk analysis of your supplier. At the same time, you need to monitor them so you can be proactive when it comes to risk management. And once you have done the risk analysis, you have to take the right remedial measures and preventive measures to mitigate the risk in your supply chain. You have to document all of this. So this is where Prewave then again helps the clients, because the system will track every single step that the end user is taking when it comes to risk management, for then the user to then submit the final report at the end of the year. Yeah, so for example, the Norwegian Transparency Act has a reporting deadline, which is the end of June. So all our clients who are based in Norway, they are basically submitting the report based and pulled out of Prewave, adding all the final information which they have internally to submit it to the authorities in Norway, for example. Yeah, and all our German clients, they are currently in the phase that they are doing the risk analysis and taking the right preventive and remedial measures to then submit the final report to the BAFA. And in some countries, you have to also publish the report that you basically create on your ESG and supply chain due diligence on your company website as well. When it comes to risk management, what we realize is that we need a new approach when it comes to the risk analysis or risk management in your supply chain. So we basically came up with a more pragmatic solution approach, which is also scalable for a lot of companies who have, let's say, more than 10,000 suppliers, 20,000 suppliers. Some of our clients have more than 50 or 80,000 tier 1 suppliers. So the solution approach has to be scalable, meaning that we will start with the risk analysis approach and then focus on taking the right preventive and remedial measures for the critical suppliers in your supply chain. This means that in the very first step, we will set up all tier 1 suppliers in the system, and every single tier 1 supplier will receive an initial risk analysis based on country and industry risk. And this static analysis in the very first step is an indication to then define the substantial suppliers in your supply chain, to then identify the suppliers that you want to monitor in Prewave, because not every single supplier that you're working with has to be monitored. There are some customers who are monitoring all of them, but in a lot of cases, there are also suppliers which are, I don't know, for example, based in Germany, where the spend is very low, where you don't have a very high influence on the supplier, where you probably don't have to monitor them. And that's why the country and industry risk is basically there as an indication to then identify the substantial suppliers. And depending on your day-to-day business, this could be, for example, 20% of your tier 1 suppliers. This could also be 50% of your tier 1 suppliers. But very important here is that they go into the next phase of the risk management cycle, which is the red flag screening. So it's a background check that we do on the suppliers, asking what has happened in the last 24 to 36 months, to then score the supplier a bit more accurately, in addition to the country and industry risk. And on top of that, very important here, all substantial suppliers go into the monitoring, which means that the end user will receive notifications and alerts if something happens at those substantial suppliers. And this would then help the end user to identify the critical suppliers, to take the right corrective actions, which you can then track and trace in the system with the corrective action planner. You can work with your colleagues to create the tickets, to work through the assessments. And in the very last step, you have the red flag suppliers, the critical suppliers, where you can then take actions like an on-site audit, for example, to then work together with the supplier and identify why the supplier is a high-risk supplier, and where we then could also, for example, suggest partners where you get on board to help mitigate the risk of your critical 0.1 or 1% suppliers, where there have been some incidents as well. And I've mentioned here a couple of times already monitoring. Yeah, what does monitoring actually mean? Monitoring functionality has been the very first functionality, the algorithm which has been developed since 2002, when the PhD research started. Monitoring basically means that every single tier 1 supplier that has been in the system and is in the monitoring, the algorithm accesses all publicly available data and is analyzing all publicly available data. Very important here, in real time and in more than 50 plus languages, consolidates this data to then send out the incident reports, or what we call it, alerts, to the end user. So depending on the user's perspective, for example, disruption, they could receive alerts regarding a labor strike coming up, or if the user is using Prewave for due diligence topics, it could be child labor or human rights violation alerts, getting into the newsfeed, or getting this information by email or an API integration, for example. And analyzing the data in the local language is specifically important because we do not have to wait until the information is out there in English or in German. Because if you have suppliers in Southeast Asia, for example, and there are children working in the factories, the information is not going to be in the German or in the English newspaper. It's going to be reported in the local newspaper, or it's going to be reported on social media in the local language. Hence why it's so important to access this data in the local language, to analyze this data in the local language, and send out the notification as soon as possible to the right users who are interested and responsible for this type of information. The scoring of the suppliers is one component, because risk management is a bit more than just scoring a supplier. The scoring is one of two components, and the second component is the impact or the degree of influence. And this is basically looking at two different aspects depending on what you are interested in. So for example, if you're looking at the supplier from an ESG or sustainability topic, the impact will be what is the influence that you have on the supplier. So what the analysis is being done by taking the spend that you have with the supplier and dividing it by the total revenue of the supplier. Because it makes a huge difference if there are human rights violations at a tier 1 supplier, which is a global company, and where you make up, let's say, less than 1% of the total revenue of the supplier, because you don't really have an influence on what the company is doing. But at the same time, if you're working with, let's say, a very local supplier in Southeast Asia, and the supplier is making, let's say, 1 million in revenue, and you have a spend with the supplier of, let's say, 300,000, which might not be a lot for you, but that's making up 30% of the total revenue of the supplier. It means that you have a very critical influence on that supplier. And in the risk management aspect, it means that you would have to prioritize the small supplier where your impact is higher compared to the global company where your impact is lower. So the system will then calculate the influence and the risk classification by combining the scoring of the supplier and the influence that you have on the supplier. If you're looking at the supplier from a disruption perspective, the system will use different data. The system is then asking the question, what type of influence does the supplier has on your day-to-day business? So a single source supplier will have a higher impact than a supplier where you can find a different supplier within 1 or 2 days. Or the data that we also need in the system from your side would be, for example, how high is the inventory that you have with the supplier? Do you have spare inventory? Or do you have maybe a logistics inventory coming up soon? Or do you not have any spare inventory? And if the supplier has a disruption, for example, it would have a high impact. And by combining the scoring and the impact that the supplier has on your business, the risk classification will be different and calculated completely new in the disruption perspective, for example. And the main goal of the end user should always be to prioritize the critical suppliers, which are in the dark red or in the red zone, and try their best to bring them from the critical zone into the yellow or the green zone, which is the safe zone. And when it comes to the ESG topics and sustainability topics, it doesn't have to mean that you have to offboard suppliers or that you have to do on-site audits at the supplier. It could mean that you work together with the supplier. The supplier could get, I don't know, TÜV certified, for example, ISO certified. For example, you can ask the supplier to provide trainings for their employees, health and safety training, for example, environmental issue topic trainings, and then improve the scoring of the supplier. And from a disruption perspective, you can then, for example, look at different suppliers that you want to work with. Or another approach would be to change your product or production capacity a little bit to basically diversify, which is, of course, a bit harder than finding a new supplier. But the main aim is that the system will give you an indication of which are the high risk suppliers and which suppliers you should be focusing on, and then also prioritize the suppliers from top to bottom that you should be taking actions. Just to summarize, step 1, we help buyers and ESG experts, sustainability experts and companies globally to identify the risk This is in the very first step by looking at the country risk and the industry risk, then doing the screening of the suppliers and checking what has happened in the past at the supplier. And on top of that, you can then, of course, identify the critical commodities that you are interested in, and also identify the sub-tier suppliers that are relevant and critical for you. This is definitely a topic that will come up in the next 1 or 2 years for a lot more companies. At the moment, the top of the top companies with the best supply chains in the world, they focus on supply chain mapping and monitoring the tier 1 and tier N suppliers. But this is definitely going to be a topic latest with the CSDDD, that a lot of companies have to look at not just the tier 1, but also the tier N supplier base. The second step, of course, when it comes to risk management, is to identify and evaluate the risks and then prioritize the risk. Because you cannot focus on all of your tier 1 suppliers at once. Hence why it's important that the system will then show you the critical suppliers from top to bottom and say, these are the top critical red flag suppliers that you should be taking and focusing on in the very first step. And based on the prioritization, the system will always give you the next steps when it comes to mitigating the risk as well. It could be something like creating a ticket and putting a supplier or the ticket on the watch list to work together with your colleagues. It could be creating a ticket in the system and working with the corrective action planner. You can assign tickets to your colleague or a team for them to then look at the supplier. Or it could be, for example, sending out a self-assessment to the supplier. Very important here. We do not say that self-assessments are bad. We just focus on self-assessments when it comes to sending them out for a preventive measure or remedial measure, and not in the risk analysis part. For the very top critical red flag suppliers, we also recommend working with partners, consulting partners like Vectra, or like audit partners, for example, like TÜV Süd, employee training partners like Quizzer, for them to be then able to step in and assist you when it comes to risk management. And the last step, of course, everything is summarized and tracked in the system for then the users to provide a management dashboard for board members, for example, or to pull the report out of the system and then submit it to authorities, like our Norwegian countries are doing it with the NTA this week, and our German clients will be doing this at the beginning of next year. Basically, all companies who are affected 2023 need to submit the reports 2024. And with that, I'm gonna pass it on again to Lawrence.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. And I'm going to turn on my screen again, so I hope everybody can see that. So thank you very much, Jeswin. That was a brilliant run through the different elements which really make up risk management, and I would like to build on a number of these elements. Now, I think what has become very clear is actually that when this risk analysis is being done, this is not the goal in itself, right? And I'm saying this also a little bit with regards to the last 25 plus years, where many companies have been doing a lot of things in order to analyze risks. Of course, when we go back 25 years, of course, there were not that great and sophisticated tools as the one of Prewave, for instance. So companies were using a lot of social audits. Of course, they asked companies to do self-assessment in their supply chain. They visited factories themselves. They gathered information from different stakeholder sources, and they got a certain overview on the risks which exist and which could maybe also exist on top of what they saw, particularly in the global supply chain. However, at that stage, it was basically a common view that this gathering of risk information was not the solution to the challenge, right? Because the thing is that something needs to happen with this risk information. And for a number of reasons, companies were struggling a lot, and probably are still struggling with, we have so much information, where do we need to start actually? Where does it actually make sense to start? Where can we actually make a difference? Where can we actually make an impact in addressing these different risks? Now, and this is if I may say so, basically the key message I also want to bring across in this webinar from my side, because there's many different aspects we are highlighting in this webinar, but I think the underlying message from my side is really, if you have this risk information, it is important that you do something with it, act upon it, right? And one of the key drivers for this, of course, is also that now against the background of the legislation which we have in place, be it the German Supply Chain Act, or be it the CSDD from the EU, or other legislations, actually these legislations request companies to act upon this knowledge on risks. And that is really important. And ideally, before you even as a company have done this kind of analysis of the risks, you already have gone through a materiality assessment that you have already identified on the basis of what your stakeholders are asking you to focus on, that you know where are the key topics which are material to your company, where you need to make sure that there you need to be kind of safe, there you need to be resilient. There, if you are, for instance, a chemical company, naturally, when it comes to chemical management, everything which is related to it, be it workplace safety for the workers, or when it comes to environmental questions, that topic is really something you are very strong on, and you have many measures in place. This just as one example. Now, you see here that setting priorities is important, and when we talk about priorities and action to be taken on the basis of risk analysis, it is also important that this does not only focus on your supply chain, right? It also needs to focus on your own company. Now, your own company is, of course, nice two words, but own company can mean a huge company with thousands and tens of thousands of employees. It could also be a small family business, right? So whatever the situation is, it's important to also look inside when we have risk information. What kind of screws do we need to turn in order to make this risk, or let's say to address the risks from the side of our own organization, before we look also into the supply chain and ask business partners, or try to kind of take influence on tier N suppliers to change certain practices. So this is also very important, that we have this kind of sight in both directions. Now, going back to the risk analysis information, the more granular, the more specific it is, and I think Jeswin has also presented this very well, that you can really take this very granular view on what these risks really are and which area. And that is also important, because only this enables you to actually go for the real reasons why these risks exist, right? And this is basically what, I guess many of you know this term of the root cause analysis, right? This is really a key. You need to be enabled to do a proper root cause analysis, because otherwise acting upon these risks will be very difficult, because you need to address really the root causes of the risks. So this is really a key. We need to really understand properly where are things really going wrong, because only then we can identify what are the measures which actually really make sense to address these risks, and to identify the right measures. Now, if we go back to the priority setting aspect of it, and Jeswin has also touched upon this very clearly, of course, it's a question where as a company you have leverage, right? That is definitely one element. Now, but that's not the only one. The other question is also, what is the severity of the risk, right? I mean, are we talking about, I mean, practically speaking, are we talking about an overtime issue? That the reality in a company somewhere is exceeding the legal stipulations on overtime, or are we finding out that there's a risk of forced labor or child labor, right? So it is very important then also to see, do first things first, right? Everything is important, but let's focus on these things which are particularly touching and harming really human rights at a very tough scale, and particularly also when it comes to the amount and the magnitude of the risk and the violations. And I should also, in this context, also say that we again have to differentiate a little bit between a risk as such, so the danger that something turns into harm and a violation, or existing violations, right? But again, looking at the leverage, the severity of the violation or the risk, and also the magnitude of that are elements to really set these priorities. And again, it also helps us, where do we need to take action to address this? When we talk about leverage, this is of course something where we need to see what can we do as a company to actually increase this leverage or use this leverage to do something. And in order to see whether in our own processes and procedures in our own company, something is maybe missing, maybe we have to be more clear, maybe it's a lack of internal communication, right? So that from our side, we take all the right measures, so to say, in order to influence the supply chain and the supply chain actors where we see those most severe risks, and enable them also and help them to overcome these problems, right? So, and talking about the supply chain, there's of course also different avenues in order to prioritize, and that goes back, of course, also again to who are really the significant suppliers we have, what kind of risk is there. I also would like to share one example, which I know from previous years, so to say, that there was child labor in a factory of a company, which was not a, let's say, constant and continuous supplier of a larger retailer in Europe, but that was just a test order which had been done, right? But at the end of the day, nobody cares. It doesn't matter, right? So even if it was just a test order, it was just a very small volume of business you did with someone, if there is a high risk, you need to act upon it. You have to do something upon it. So it is, again, always looking at what kind of risk are we really concretely talking about in order to determine where do we set the priority. Even if it's small volume, we need to act upon it first before we get to others. Yeah. So that is something I wanted to highlight here in this context. Now, again, when we have the root causes, which I mentioned before, if we know where the problem's actually really stemming from, that actually really enables us then to identify what are the measures we need to do. I already mentioned, are maybe guidelines lacking? Is maybe a training lacking? Is it maybe a lack of internal communication or communication with the supply chain? It could be all kinds of different measures which could be taken. We typically differentiate between preventative and remediation measures. So the key is, of course, and that's the purpose of the whole risk management topic and risk analysis, that we take the necessary measures to mitigate, remediate, and stop the violations. And this is actually also the wording which you find in the different legislations, which are there. Also, if we take the CSDDD directive of the EU, it's very clear that it's always very much highlighted. Mitigation of risk is fine, but actually the goal is to end the harm, stop the violation. That is really the key. Now, it might be, again, that maybe there is not yet a violation, there is maybe the risk, the pure risk, the danger that something turns into a violation. So then, of course, we need to take preventative measures. Now, these legislations make this differentiation also very clear between preventative and remediation measures. And sometimes the borderline between the two is a little bit blurry. And sometimes you can argue, is this now preventative? Is this now remediation action? But at the end of the day, that might also seem a little bit academic. It does not really matter. It is important that the right measures are being taken, effective measures are being taken to stop a violation, at least mitigate it. And if you see that something might turn into a violation, to take the appropriate steps to avoid that this risk turns into a violation, a harm to rights of people or harm to the environment, right? So, and that means there's these different things you could do as a company to address these and take these measures. Again, it can be training, it can be guidelines, it can be implementation of specific action plans. Jeswin had also pointed this out. I mean, very often, of course, as an outcome of social audits, for instance, or environmental assessments, you have action plans, corrective action plans. Now, there again, my message comes, the plan is, at the end of the day, a piece of paper, right? So the important thing is that's to put it into place. That is key. Of course, the corrective action plan needs to be solid in the sense that it needs to address the root causes of the risks and the violations. That is why, again, the risk analysis data needs to be specific enough that we can draw up meaningful, effective action plans, but they need to be implemented. That is really very, very important. And that's, of course, a field where typically also Vectra International supports clients with who have these corrective action plans with the suppliers, but say, okay, it is not enough to share these plans. Somebody needs to help our suppliers to actually implement these, because there's plans where companies are struggling with, okay, I know that I need to do this and this and this, but how does this actually work from a very practical point of view? Is there somebody who can help me with this? Is there somebody who can guide me? Somebody who can coach me in order to get this right? So this is also something where particularly we as Vectra support clients in this, of course, also in the design of training or guidelines and implementation of these. But again, what is important is this guidance of suppliers to implement corrective actions and naturally to round up the whole set of actions and opportunities. Of course, also all our partners are an integral part of this view at taking preventative and remediation measures. So, and that brings me to another item, which I think is also important in this regard. When we are talking about risk analysis, when we are talking about risk management, we also need to cycle back to something, particularly the legislations are all very keen on when it comes to the stipulations for companies, because companies need to draw up a policy. Typically, there's the expectation you need to draw up a human rights policy, right? Or a policy which addresses your risk management. Now, this is typically something which you cannot really do as a very first step, because if you look at some of this legislation, you will see that this policy would need to describe actually what kind of risks have you identified? How are you prioritizing them? Respectively, which risks have you prioritized for your own company, right? With regards to your own organization, with regards to your supply chain. And then you should at least give an outline of how you address these risks, right? And all that you can basically only do, and you can only kind of complete this policy once you have thought through this whole process of, and actually implemented part of this process of, okay, what are the risks, right? How do we set the priorities? What are the 2-3 key issues our company needs to focus on? Because they're material to us and our stakeholders, and actually we have the necessary leverage to address these things. Yeah, and we need to act upon it. So for instance, company X is focusing on addressing forced labor, gender issues, and chemical management. Just as an example, right? These are the 3 key topics we focus on. And you would need to clearly mention this also in the policy with giving an idea how you practically address it, right? So that is why, again, my message here is when you are to design this policy, you need to go through this risk management process, right? And set these basics, right? In order to have a complete human rights policy. And of course, when you then implement this risk management over time, you will see that, oh, we need to adjust a little bit here. We need to adjust a little bit there. Maybe we have to readjust certain priorities. And that is absolutely fine. That is absolutely okay. You can and you should review your human rights policy also on a regular basis, and then make these changes also visible, right? Because I think what is also very important when we talk about managing risks, we are not talking about something static. We are not talking about something you do on a Friday afternoon, right? I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it is something which never goes off the table. It is something continuous. It's a journey. You will always have to do a continuous risk management. And therefore also everything which comes along with it, the whole risk analysis approach, the risk management approaches, the preventative and corrective measures you take, the policies, the guidelines you do, you need to also review from time to time to adapt them to the given circumstances. And that is also important simply because you need to regularly report. I mean, particularly when your company is in scope of this due diligence, sustainability legislation, then of course you need to report, right? So it's one thing to do the risk management, but you also have to explain to the outside, to governmental authorities, to stakeholders, how you are doing. And I say how because it's not just reporting about what you do, but actually how you do, right? And it's extremely important also that you can demonstrate that the things you do are actually effective, right? So, and that brings us back again to the data and the data quality, which is stemming from your risk analysis and which basically follows through your entire risk management process, because that is decisive to actually be able to measure the impact of your actions, whether you have been able with your actions you've taken to actually really stop or at least mitigate risks. This is what the legislators wanted to know, right? So you need to come up with, first as a basis, you need data, you need to come up with metrics, you need to come up with KPIs in order to have this kind of measurement in place. And that can be a quite challenging process, but it's decisive to have a proper reporting. And of course, when we talk about the data and quality of data in general, it is always advisable to kind of adapt that, or to apply the SMART criteria. So basically, it's about specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound criteria of we have to look at, so that this data really is good enough to actually serve also a measurement which you need to report on, right? And it's not only governments who might ask companies to do this sort of reporting and who want to understand more how you do these things, but it's actually also your customers, right? It's clients, it's all kind of different stakeholders who might be interested in that. And that basically, I'm conscious of time. And so this is basically where that brings me to my very last slide. So basically, just in a nutshell, also to highlight briefly again how we can support as Vectra International. We are more than happy to, of course, support any company and organization on these different steps. And we typically tailor this really to the specific situation of the company. So it's not our approach to take something off the shelf and say, well, that is the solution, but we really look at what is the solution which fits you, also focused on a quick return on investment, so that you consider a collaboration with us not as a cost, but as a useful and effective and efficient investment, actually. So it's all about responsible business, what I already mentioned at the very beginning. That is really our specialty, to support organizations in this framework of responsible business. And of course, that goes together with our partners like Prewave. And we have a global team which can help you in different countries of the world. So that is basically what I wanted to share with you at that point. So I give it back to Nina.
Thank you very much, Lorenz. Also, thank you very much to Jeswin, of course. Thank you to both of you for sharing your expertise with us this afternoon. So now we do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. First one goes to Jeswin. Michelle. Michelle is asking, how quick does the system react? For example, if there's a factory burning out in China, how quick does that get into an alert?
Okay, yeah, good question. I think you also mentioned in your question the fire in China. I think it was the biggest disruption of 2023 in the semiconductor industry. I looked it up for you while Lorenz was talking, just to check if we had it in the system as well. So the fire happened on January 6th, and I also have the alerting in our system on January 6th, because again, we are analyzing this data in the local language. Very important here also is that we do need some sort of information. Yeah, so for example, a supplier calling the customer, would not be information enough for us to create the alerting. But I can share my screen with you, and I can basically show you the alerting in our system itself. So Prewave, 5 months ago, January 6th, you can see the fire in China happening, and the fire actually happened in China as well. And I also checked the first media coverage of this incident was on January 26th. So it was either people reading about it in Europe on the English media 20 days afterwards, or getting this information in the meantime from their suppliers. So it always depends on where this information is coming from. But if the data is available in the local language, we are able to create the alerting for you. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
All right. Cool. So next question, also geared towards you, Jeswin. Sarah's asking, is it an option in Prewave to collaborate with ERP systems like Jagger, Microsoft Dynamics, etc.? And does Prewave show the supply chain graphically, like supplier A, B, C visible on a world map with arrows or something?
Okay, so first question, yes, we do. So we are working with REST APIs, so we can basically pull data from your ERP or procurement suite, where you select the suppliers that are being monitored in Prewave, or the other way around as well. So you can basically pull the news feed or the risk scoring from Prewave via the API, via the REST API into your ERPs or procurement suite, for example. Yeah, so we have, for example, I think you have mentioned Jagger. We have a standard connector to Jagger. We have also have clients where we have a connection, API integration to Jagger already. The second question was if we show the supplier relationship. Yes, we do. So you can pull up any tier 1 supplier where we have done the supply chain mapping, and you can then see the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 level suppliers in the system after we have basically done like a analysis of which are the relevant sub-tier suppliers for you, because only the relevant and critical suppliers are being uploaded in and set up in the system. And also very important here is that you can then apply like a commodity filter or a category filter to then find out, for example, if you have a tier 1 supplier who is providing silicon materials to you, you can then put the silicon filter on the tier N suppliers to see who are the tier N suppliers working with silicon in the supply chain. So it's not on a world map with a lot of different drawings. It's basically on the supplier profile with like a tree graph in our system.
All right, and last question for Justin. So how does Prewave make sure that the publicly available data, given it is on social media and all of that, is correct?
A very good question. As you can imagine, analyzing publicly available data is not the easiest thing in the world because there's a lot of fake news in there as well. So that's one of the main capabilities of the algorithm. And that's also one of the main jobs from our data science team, to train the algorithm so that the algorithm basically understands what's real news, what's fake news. And there's also in certain cases a middle step where if the algorithm is not 100% sure, that information goes to the data science team and they will check it manually and then decide, should we create this alert or is this a false positive, for example?
All right, thank you. And then we do have another question for Lorenz from Paulina. So you've mentioned that planning is more important than planning is important, rather implementation is important, sorry. So regarding the proper reporting, what do you suggest for companies? What is the way to go?
Well, the proper reporting, of course, is based on who are the stakeholders or who is the key stakeholder to whom you want to report. I mean, we are taking an approach that we kind of have a more generic approach on all the different elements you would need to report or you could report, and we would basically tailor this existing solution to the specific needs of your company, depending on who are your stakeholders and what are the elements, what are actually these metrics and KPIs you need to have as a basis for your very individual reporting. And then we would basically boil this big, let's say, basis tool down to your specific needs as a company, and then would see together with you how we can fill this with life, meaning with the respective data to enable a good reporting, right? Because there is not this one size fits all thing as such, because again, the stakeholders are asking for slightly different information, sometimes in a different format. So that is why we would tailor, let's say, the bigger tool to your specific company needs.
All right, wonderful. So if there aren't any more questions, I would like to thank everyone for attending today. As I said, the recording and the presentation as well will be made available to you. If you have any further questions coming up, I'll trust it will be okay to reach out to Lawrence and Jeswin via LinkedIn. And sure, then I have one more announcement to make tomorrow. You've maybe saw it on Jeswin's slide, very small there in the corner. We've introduced our new Prewave Action Platform at our Prewave Day in May, and tomorrow at 10 a.m. Central European Time, we will have a webinar introducing the platform to everyone who wasn't able to come there. So if you like to have a glimpse at that, feel free to go to our website to About Us and Events and sign up for the webinar tomorrow there. All right. Then looking forward to seeing everyone tomorrow, maybe. And again, thank you for attending. Again, thank you to Jeswin and Lawrence for sharing your expertise with us. And have a very good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.